What if the greatest treasure hidden inside a 2,000-year-old redwood tree wasn't gold, but a forgotten promise that could save an entire forest? After their own children sold the family farm and left them behind, 79-year-old Harold Carter and his wife Margaret returned to the woods with nothing but heartbreak. Deep inside a giant redwood, they uncovered a small metal box Harold had buried as a boy. Inside were ancient seeds, a hand-drawn water map, and his grandfather's final journal. What began as one family's last refuge would soon become the miracle that brought an entire dying forest back to life. Late autumn settled over Redwood National Park beneath a silver-gray sky. Cool Pacific winds carried the scent of damp earth and towering redwoods while fallen fern leaves blanketed the forest floor, waiting quietly for another Northern California winter. Harold Carter had spent nearly 8 decades believing that trees remembered what people often forgot. At 79 years old, he still stood a little over 6 feet tall, though years of hard work had curved his broad shoulders into the posture of a man who had carried far more than lumber. Thick silver hair framed a deeply lined face weathered by sun, rain, and countless seasons spent outdoors. His neatly trimmed white beard softened a square jaw once known for stubborn determination, while calm gray-blue eyes still reflected the quiet strength that had earned the respect of everyone who knew him. His hands remained enormous and rough, every callus telling the story of 55 years spent pruning apple trees, repairing fences, building barns, and helping neighbors without ever asking for payment. Harold rarely spoke about himself. He preferred listening. Throughout his life, people trusted him because he never rushed to judge anyone. His father often said Harold had inherited the patience of the redwoods themselves. Unfortunately, patience sometimes made disappointment hurt even more deeply. Standing beside him was Margaret Carter, his 77-year-old wife and the only person who had shared every chapter of his life since they married more than 50 years earlier. Margaret was 5 feet 5 with a graceful, slender figure that age had never managed to diminish. Her shoulder-length silver hair rested neatly beneath a knitted forest green hat, while warm hazel eyes carried endless kindness behind the quiet sadness of recent weeks. Fine wrinkles framed a gentle smile that had comforted children, neighbors, and friends for decades. Her fair skin still held the faint freckles she had inherited as a young girl growing up along California's northern coast. Years spent tending orchards, preserving fruit, and raising 2 children had left her hands small but remarkably capable. She possessed an inner calm that made frightened people feel safe simply by sitting beside her. Whenever Harold struggled beneath the weight of worry, Margaret never searched for perfect words. She simply reached for his hand, and somehow that had always been enough. Everything they still owned now fit inside an aging blue pickup truck parked outside a county storage building. 20 acres of apple orchards, the farmhouse Harold had built with his own father, the old red barn where generations of harvest festivals had been celebrated. All of it belonged to someone else. Their son, Daniel Carter, 51 years old, had once been the pride of the family. Tall, clean-cut, with neatly combed dark hair beginning to gray around the temples, Daniel had built a successful investment company in San Francisco before several disastrous business decisions buried him beneath overwhelming debt. Intelligent, ambitious, and confident, he genuinely believed every problem had a financial solution. He convinced himself that selling the family orchard would rescue everyone. His intentions were never cruel, but years inside corporate boardrooms slowly taught him to measure value in numbers instead of memories. Standing beside him during the sale had been his younger sister, Olivia Brooks, 47, an accomplished corporate attorney whose elegant appearance and carefully chosen words often concealed constant anxiety about security and success. She loved her parents sincerely, but she had spent so many years solving problems logically that she overlooked the emotional cost of her decisions. Together they promised Harold and Margaret that everything would be temporary. "We just need a little time," Daniel had assured them after signing the final documents. "Come stay in a motel for a couple of weeks. We'll prepare the guest house in San Francisco." Olivia smiled reassuringly. "You'll be much safer there." Harold believed every word. Why wouldn't he? Parents spend their entire lives believing that their children mean exactly what they say. The first week passed. Then another. Phone calls became shorter. Text messages became less frequent. Soon even those stopped arriving altogether. Each morning Harold quietly checked his phone before Margaret awoke, hoping perhaps he had missed a message overnight. Each evening, he slipped the silent phone back into his pocket before she could notice the disappointment on his face. Margaret noticed anyway. One afternoon, while they sat on the tailgate of the old pickup watching rain fall across the empty parking lot, she gently rested her hand over his weathered fingers. "They're probably overwhelmed," she whispered. Harold forced a faint smile. "I know." But somewhere deep inside, another thought had begun growing. Perhaps their children had slowly convinced themselves that their parents no longer belonged in the life they had built. 3 days later, Harold climbed behind the wheel before sunrise. Margaret looked at him curiously. "Where are we going?" Harold smiled for the first time in weeks. "Home." 2 hours later, the highway disappeared behind them. The narrow mountain road wound through towering coast redwoods whose massive trunks rose like ancient pillars into the mist. Shafts of pale sunlight filtered through branches nearly 300 feet above, painting the forest floor with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Ferns carpeted the earth. Moss covered fallen logs. The silence felt alive. Every curve awakened memories Harold had buried for decades. He remembered fishing in icy streams with his grandfather. He remembered building tiny shelters from fallen branches. Most vividly of all, he remembered one extraordinary afternoon when he was 10 years old. His grandfather, Samuel Carter, had led him to the largest redwood in the valley, a tree so enormous that 6 grown men holding hands could barely surround its trunk. Samuel had handed the boy a small iron box. "Someday," the old man had said with a mysterious smile, "you'll understand why this belongs here." Together they placed it inside a deep natural hollow hidden within the massive trunk. Harold had never returned. Life became busy. Marriage, children, the orchard. Decades quietly slipped away. Now, nearly 70 years later, the giant redwood still stood exactly where memory had left it. Its reddish bark rose like the wall of an ancient cathedral, scarred by centuries of storms, yet impossibly alive. The hollow remained hidden behind curtains of fern and moss, larger than Harold remembered, dry and remarkably well protected from rain. Margaret stared at the enormous tree. "You've thought about this place all these years?" Harold nodded slowly. "I just never thought I'd need it." Without another word, they carried blankets, tools, and the few belongings they still owned into the vast hollow. The space was surprisingly spacious, naturally sheltered from wind, its living walls wrapping around them with quiet strength. Margaret looked around uncertainly. "We're really going to live here?" Harold rested one hand against the ancient redwood. "If God has protected this tree for nearly 2,000 years, he said softly, perhaps he protected it for someone who would someday need hope." As evening shadows settled through the forest, Harold knelt before the hidden corner where childhood memory guided him. His fingers brushed away decades of loose soil and fallen leaves. A dull metallic edge appeared beneath the earth. His heartbeat quickened. Slowly, carefully, he lifted an old iron box that had remained untouched for nearly 70 years. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the towering crowns of the ancient redwoods, painting long golden beams across the forest floor. Cool mist lingered beneath the giant trees while distant birdsong echoed through a wilderness that seemed untouched by time. Harold Carter carried the old iron box onto a fallen redwood log, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he brushed away nearly 70 years of dust, moss, and rust. Margaret Carter sat quietly beside him, watching with patient curiosity. She had seen Harold nervous only a handful of times during their 55 years together, when their first child was born, when he buried his parents, and when they signed away the orchard that had belonged to the Carter family for 3 generations. Whatever rested inside this forgotten box seemed to carry the same weight. The corroded latch resisted at first. Then, with a soft metallic click, it finally gave way. Harold slowly lifted the lid. The scent of aged paper and cedar drifted into the cool mountain air. Everything inside had been carefully wrapped in waxed canvas, preserving it from moisture through decades hidden inside the living tree. The first object Harold lifted was a thick leather journal. Its cover was cracked with age, yet the words burned into the leather remained perfectly readable. Samuel Carter. Forest Journal. 1954, Harold smiled sadly. His grandfather had never attended college. Yet everyone who knew Samuel considered him the wisest man in Del Norte County. Tall and powerfully built with broad shoulders earned from decades working among the giant redwoods, Samuel had worn a full gray beard and possessed calm amber eyes that seemed capable of reading forests as easily as other people read newspapers. He rarely raised his voice, believing nature had already provided every lesson worth learning if people slowed down long enough to observe it. During Harold's childhood, Samuel often disappeared into the woods for days carrying only an axe, a notebook, and enough food for a week. Many neighbors assumed he was eccentric. Harold always believed he was simply listening to something everyone else had forgotten how to hear. Beneath the journal rested several small linen bags. Harold untied the first one. Tiny redwood seeds spilled gently into his palm. Another bag contained Douglas fir. Another held tan oak. Another contained native California bay laurel. Each cloth pouch carried Samuel's careful handwriting identifying both species and the exact valley where the seeds had been collected decades earlier. Margaret looked surprised. He saved an entire forest. Harold nodded silently. Underneath the seed bags lay a carefully folded hand-drawn map. Its edges had yellowed with age, but the ink remained remarkably clear. Samuel had sketched every ridge, creek, meadow, and ancient grove surrounding the valley. Blue lines marked underground springs. Small circles identified forgotten natural ponds. Red arrows highlighted areas repeatedly damaged by wildfire long before modern fire maps existed. Harold recognized places he had not visited since childhood. One handwritten note caught his attention. Water remembers every path, even after people force it to forget. Margaret studied the map closely. These streams aren't on today's maps. They used to be. Harold traced one faded blue line with his finger. When I was little, Grandpa said they disappeared after logging companies built diversion dams upstream. Near the bottom of the box rested several faded black and white photographs. One showed Samuel standing beside the same giant redwood, smiling beside 10-year-old Harold proudly holding the iron box. Another captured Harold's parents planting young trees after a wildfire. Another showed dozens of volunteers restoring a damaged creek nearly 60 years earlier. Harold's eyes slowly filled with tears. So much of this, I had forgotten. Margaret gently squeezed his shoulder. Maybe that's why your grandfather hid it. Harold finally opened the journal. The first pages recorded rainfall, bird migrations, flowering seasons, and water levels stretching across decades. Later entries became increasingly personal. Samuel wrote about watching logging roads divide wildlife habitat. He described streams growing weaker after concrete barriers redirected natural water. He worried that future generations might inherit forests that still looked alive but had quietly begun dying beneath the surface. Hours passed as Harold continued reading. Finally, he reached the last page. Only one sentence appeared. When the forest begins to disappear, plant before you cut. Harold read it again. Then again. Neither of them understood. There was no explanation. No instructions. Only 7 simple words. Margaret closed the journal gently. What do you think he meant? Harold looked toward the endless forest surrounding the ancient redwood. I honestly don't know. He stood slowly. But Grandpa never wasted words. The following morning they began working. Not because they understood Samuel's final lesson. Because they trusted the man who had written it. Using old hand tools found inside an abandoned maintenance shed, Harold carefully cleared invasive brush, choking young native saplings. Margaret planted handfuls of Samuel's preserved seeds wherever patches of healthy soil remained beneath the towering trees. Together they followed the old map, searching for forgotten springs. Many had been buried beneath decades of fallen debris. Others had been blocked by crude earthen dams built years earlier to redirect water toward abandoned logging operations. Harold quietly dismantled each obstruction by hand, allowing cold mountain water to flow freely once again through channels nature had carved centuries before. Week after week they continued. The forest slowly changed. Small birds returned to newly flowing creeks. Ferns spread across damp soil. Tiny seedlings appeared where sunlight reached the ground. Yet to everyone driving along the nearby mountain road, the elderly couple looked completely ridiculous. Most people saw only 2 old strangers wandering through the woods carrying buckets of seeds and digging beside forgotten streams. One afternoon, a passing pickup truck slowed. Several locals laughed openly. There go the crazy old tree people again. Within days, someone painted a cardboard sign near the highway. The Crazy Tree Couple. Soon the nickname spread throughout the small towns surrounding Redwood National Park. Harold heard it. Margaret heard it. Neither replied. As evening settled beneath the towering redwoods, Harold planted another tiny seed beside a newly flowing stream. He smiled quietly. Perhaps forests, like faith, often began growing long before anyone else believed something beautiful was happening. Summer arrived beneath a cloudless Northern California sky. Week after week, dry winds swept through Redwood National Park, carrying the sharp scent of sun-baked earth instead of cool ocean mist. Streams that had flowed for centuries shrank into narrow ribbons, while the towering forests waited beneath an unforgiving sun that seemed determined to test everything rooted in the soil. By early July, newspapers across California had begun calling it the worst drought in more than half a century. Crews from the state forestry department measured record-low soil moisture. Fire danger reached its highest category weeks earlier than expected. Helicopters circled overhead searching for smoke columns, while electronic warning signs appeared along highways reminding visitors that a single spark could destroy thousands of acres. Harold Carter read the headlines each morning without saying much. He simply folded the newspaper, picked up Samuel's journal, and returned to the forest. Months of quiet work had transformed his daily routine. Before sunrise, he and Margaret walked the old trails carrying buckets of native seeds collected from the previous season's young trees. Harold inspected every spring marked on Samuel's hand-drawn map, removing fallen branches or loose sediment whenever water slowed. Margaret carefully documented new seedlings, birds, insects, and flowering plants inside a notebook that had gradually become a continuation of Samuel's journal. Neither of them believed they were accomplishing anything extraordinary. They were simply following instructions left behind by a man they trusted. Beyond their valley, however, the landscape changed dramatically. Hillsides turned brown. Young conifers withered beneath relentless heat. Entire patches of undergrowth died, leaving forests unnaturally quiet. Animals began abandoning familiar territories in search of water. Coyotes wandered dangerously close to highways. Black-tailed deer appeared near rural neighborhoods, searching for green vegetation. Even the birds seemed fewer with each passing week. One afternoon, Harold climbed a familiar ridge overlooking the neighboring forests. Smoke drifted upward from nearly 20 miles away. Another wildfire. He lowered his binoculars slowly. Margaret joined him. Our little stream is still flowing. Harold nodded. So are the others. Together, they followed one of Samuel's restored waterways back toward the giant redwood. Crystal-clear water still flowed steadily over smooth stones despite months without meaningful rain. Ferns remained deep green. Young redwood seedlings stood healthy beneath filtered sunlight. Fresh animal tracks covered damp soil. Margaret knelt quietly. Look! Small hoofprints crossed the muddy bank. Only minutes later, a family of black-tailed deer cautiously emerged from dense ferns. A mature doe stepped forward first, her ears constantly turning toward every unfamiliar sound. Behind her walked two healthy fawns followed by a young buck whose antlers were only beginning to develop. The animals drank peacefully before disappearing into the forest. Later that same evening, Harold heard the haunting call of a great horned owl echo through the towering trees. The following morning, a gray fox trotted confidently beside one restored stream before vanishing into thick undergrowth. Life was returning. Not everywhere. Only here. News of the unusual valley eventually reached the University of California, Berkeley. Several weeks later, a dusty hybrid SUV carefully navigated the old logging road before stopping beside the giant redwood. Stepping out was Professor Amelia Chun, a 58-year-old forest ecologist from UC Berkeley whose career had focused on wildfire resilience and old-growth ecosystem recovery throughout the American West. Standing 5'8" with a lean athletic build shaped by decades of field research, Amelia wore her dark hair streaked with silver in a practical braid beneath a faded field hat. Her warm brown eyes missed very little, constantly scanning vegetation, soil, and wildlife with scientific curiosity. Sunlight had weathered her olive-toned skin after countless summers spent studying forests from California to Oregon. Calm, patient, and intensely observant, Amelia believed the greatest scientific discoveries often came from listening to local knowledge rather than dismissing it. Years earlier, she had watched an old-growth grove disappear during a catastrophic wildfire, an experience that dedicated the rest of her career to understanding how forests could heal naturally. She introduced herself politely. "I've been studying satellite imagery of this region." Harold looked surprised. "You can see this place from space?" Amelia smiled. "Healthy vegetation reflects light differently." She slowly turned toward the restored valley. This entire section stayed greener than everything surrounding it. For 3 days, Amelia surveyed the forest. She measured soil moisture, collected water samples, recorded bird calls, examined young seedlings, counted earthworms beneath fallen leaves, installed temperature sensors beside restored streams. Every new measurement surprised her. The soil contained significantly more organic matter than neighboring forests. Native understory plants had returned naturally. Water temperatures remained lower because reopened streams flowed beneath dense vegetation. Wildlife diversity exceeded surrounding areas despite the drought. On the final afternoon, she closed her notebook and looked toward Harold. "Mr. Carter, I don't think you realize what you've done." Harold smiled awkwardly. "I planted some trees. You rebuilt an ecosystem." She held Samuel's journal carefully in both hands. "Everything you've been doing follows the same principles we now teach as modern regenerative forest restoration." Harold frowned. "I've never heard that term." "I know." Amelia gently tapped the weathered journal. "Because your grandfather understood it decades before scientists finally gave it a name." Harold looked silently toward the towering redwoods surrounding them. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he smiled softly. "Grandpa always said forests were better teachers than people." Amelia laughed quietly. "After seeing this valley, I believe he was right." 2 years passed beneath the towering redwoods, and the quiet valley Harold Carter and Margaret Carter had restored no longer resembled the forgotten forest they had first returned to. Spring wildflowers bloomed beneath the giant trees. Young redwoods reached confidently toward filtered sunlight. Crystal clear streams followed the ancient paths Samuel Carter had marked decades earlier, winding gently through moss-covered stones before disappearing beneath towering roots that had anchored themselves for nearly 2,000 years. Every morning, Harold still carried his grandfather's weathered journal, comparing each new season with notes written 70 years before, while Margaret carefully recorded birds, insects, flowering plants, and wildlife that continued returning in numbers neither of them had expected. They never imagined that everything they had quietly rebuilt would soon face its greatest test. That summer arrived hotter than any living resident could remember. Northern California baked beneath weeks of relentless heat. Dry lightning storms crossed mountain ranges without bringing rain. Winds pushed humidity to historic lows. Emergency broadcasts interrupted television programs almost daily, warning residents that wildfire conditions had reached catastrophic levels. Entire communities prepared evacuation plans before the first flames even appeared. The fire started nearly 40 miles away. At first, it looked like another distant column of smoke rising beyond the western ridges. Within 2 days, it had become an uncontrollable wall of fire consuming thousands of acres. Helicopters circled overhead. Air tankers released bright red fire retardant across steep hillsides. Hundreds of firefighters arrived from across California, Oregon, and Washington. Yet the fire continued advancing. News stations began describing it as one of the largest wildfires in decades. Computer models predicted the flames would sweep directly into the old-growth forest surrounding Harold's Valley. Most experts believed nothing could stop it. Professor Amelia Chun returned immediately after seeing updated satellite images. Standing beside Harold beneath the giant redwood, she watched smoke darken the afternoon sky. "They're preparing for the worst," she admitted quietly. Harold looked toward the distant ridgeline, where orange light flickered through heavy smoke. "My grandfather always said forests defend themselves, if people give them the chance." Before Amelia could answer, several fire engines rolled slowly down the old logging road. Leading the convoy was Captain Lucas Ramirez, a 46-year-old Cal Fire incident commander with more than 20 years of wildfire experience throughout California. Standing 6'1" with a powerful athletic build, Lucas had short black hair streaked with early gray, dark brown eyes sharpened by years of difficult decisions, and a neatly trimmed beard dusted with ash from days spent on the fire line. His face carried permanent sunlines carved by long summers beneath smoke-filled skies. Calm under pressure and deeply respected by his crews, Lucas had once lost an entire mountain community to a fast-moving wildfire early in his career. Since that day, he had devoted himself to protecting both people and landscapes, never allowing pride to override practical judgment. He studied maps spread across the hood of his command truck before looking toward Harold. "Professor Chun says you've restored this watershed." Harold nodded modestly. "We just reopened what used to be here." Lucas walked several hundred yards into the valley. Almost immediately, he noticed something unusual. The forest floor remained noticeably cooler. The soil beneath his boots felt damp instead of powder dry. Streams still flowed steadily despite months without rain. Dense native shrubs and ferns covered the ground rather than dry invasive grasses. Towering redwoods cast deep shade over moist leaf litter that resisted ignition. He stopped beside one restored creek. Cold water flowed quietly between moss-covered stones. Lucas slowly smiled. This is exactly what fire hates. As flames approached over the following 2 days, emergency planners made a decision few had expected. Instead of abandoning Harold's Valley, they transformed it into the primary defensive line. Bulldozers remained outside the restored ecosystem. Firefighters worked beside natural streams instead of replacing them. Portable pumps drew water directly from the reopened creeks Samuel had mapped decades earlier. Hand crews cleared only small sections of hazardous dead brush while preserving healthy native vegetation. Everyone hoped it would be enough. On the third afternoon, the wildfire arrived. A roaring wall of flames swept through neighboring hillsides, devouring dry undergrowth with terrifying speed. Entire slopes exploded into towering columns of fire. Trees weakened by years of drought ignited almost instantly. Yet when the flames reached Harold's restored valley, something remarkable happened. The fire slowed. Moist soil absorbed radiant heat. The reopened streams created natural barriers that interrupted advancing flames. Native hardwoods and healthy understory vegetation burned far less intensely than surrounding fuel-heavy forests. Instead of racing forward, the fire dropped from towering crown flames to manageable ground fire. Captain Ramirez immediately recognized the opportunity. He ordered every available crew into the valley. For nearly 36 exhausting hours, firefighters held the line. Water from the restored streams supplied engines without interruption. Natural fire breaks created by healthier vegetation allowed crews to work safely. By sunrise on the second morning, the massive wildfire had finally stopped. Thousands of acres beyond Harold's Valley remained untouched. News helicopters captured astonishing aerial images. Blackened mountains surrounded one broad ribbon of living green that stretched through the center of the burned scar. Scientists, firefighters, and government officials struggled to explain what they were seeing. Professor Amelia Chin quietly closed Samuel Carter's journal. "They'll call this a miracle." Harold looked toward the ancient redwood standing peacefully above the flowing creek. He smiled gently. "No, they're simply seeing what happens when people spend decades helping a forest remember how to protect itself." 3 years passed, and each season added another chapter to the story that had begun with one forgotten iron box hidden inside a 2,000-year-old redwood. The forest surrounding Harold Carter and Margaret Carter no longer resembled the neglected wilderness they had first returned to after losing their orchard. Crystal-clear streams flowed year-round beneath towering trees. Ferns covered the once barren ground. Native wildflowers painted the forest floor every spring, while birdsong echoed from sunrise until dusk. Visitors arrived not to admire a miracle, but to learn how patience, humility, and respect for nature had quietly transformed an entire landscape. What amazed scientists even more was how quickly the idea spread. Professor Amelia Chin published years of research documenting the restored watershed. Rather than describing Harold as a genius, she insisted that the greatest breakthrough had come from rediscovering practical ecological wisdom that earlier generations had nearly forgotten. Universities invited Harold to speak, but he politely declined nearly every invitation. Instead, he welcomed students into the forest itself. "The trees explain it better than I ever could," he always said. By the third year, more than 300 community forests across California, Oregon, and Washington had begun adapting Samuel Carter's principles. Volunteers reopened forgotten creeks. Local schools collected native seeds. Ranchers worked alongside conservation groups instead of arguing with them. Tribal communities shared traditional ecological knowledge that had protected western forests for centuries. Slowly, landscapes once considered beyond saving began showing signs of recovery. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening much closer to home. Residents from nearby towns quietly organized a project Harold knew nothing about. No government funded it. No corporation sponsored it. Neighbors donated cedar beams. Retired carpenters volunteered their weekends. Electricians, plumbers, roofers, and stonemasons each contributed their skills. Children collected spare change in glass jars labeled "A Home for Harold and Margaret." Before autumn returned, a beautiful cedar cabin stood only a short walk from the giant redwood. Its broad porch faced the ancient tree. Large windows overlooked the restored valley. Rainwater collection systems supplied fresh water. Solar panels blended almost invisibly into the roof. The little cabin reflected everything Harold had spent his life building for other people. Only this time, an entire community had built one for him. During the dedication ceremony, Harold stood speechless as dozens of neighbors gathered beneath the towering redwoods. Finally, he smiled. "I've spent my whole life building homes." He looked around at the volunteers. "I never imagined one day a home would be built for us." Applause echoed through the forest. Yet despite their beautiful new cabin, every Friday evening Harold and Margaret quietly carried 2 blankets, a lantern, and Samuel's journal back into the giant redwood. They still slept inside the ancient tree every weekend. Some places stopped being shelters. They became family. Late one October afternoon, nearly 8 years after selling the orchard, a dark SUV slowly climbed the narrow forest road. Harold recognized it before the engine stopped. Daniel Carter stepped out first. At 59, he looked far older than his age. His expensive tailored suits had disappeared, replaced by faded jeans and a simple work shirt. His dark hair had turned mostly gray, while deep lines surrounded tired blue eyes that no longer carried the confidence of a successful businessman. The investment company he had sacrificed everything to save had collapsed years earlier. His marriage had ended soon afterward. Success, he had finally learned, could disappear much faster than family. Olivia Brooks followed quietly behind him. Now 55, she no longer dressed like the polished attorney Harold remembered. Her chestnut hair showed streaks of silver, and her elegant confidence had softened into quiet humility. Losing several close friends during difficult years had changed the way she measured success. For the first time in decades, she had driven north without carrying a briefcase or checking her phone. Neither child spoke immediately. Daniel lowered his eyes. "Dad," his voice trembled. "I don't know if forgiveness is something we deserve." Olivia wiped away tears before looking toward Margaret. "We thought we were protecting you. We were really protecting ourselves." Silence settled beneath the towering redwoods. Harold looked at both of them for a long time. He saw regret. He saw exhaustion. Most of all, he saw his children. Without saying a word, he turned and began walking toward the giant redwood. Daniel and Olivia followed. Inside the ancient hollow, little had changed. Samuel's journal rested upon the same wooden shelf. The lantern still hung beside the entrance. The old iron box remained exactly where Harold had carefully placed it after discovering it years before. He slowly opened the lid. Everything remained untouched. The weather journal, the linen bags of seeds, the hand-drawn map, the faded family photographs. Harold gently lifted one photograph showing a 10-year-old boy standing beside his grandfather beneath the same giant tree. Then he looked at his children. Trees remember every generation. He smiled softly. Even when families forget. Daniel broke down completely. Olivia embraced her mother, unable to stop crying. No speeches followed. No dramatic explanations. Only 4 people sitting together inside a tree that had quietly witnessed nearly 2,000 years of human lives, mistakes, forgiveness, and hope. Years later, visitors rarely spoke about the elderly couple whose children had once abandoned them. They spoke about the little boy who buried an iron box inside an ancient redwood. They spoke about a grandfather who trusted the future enough to leave wisdom instead of wealth. They spoke about a forest that survived because one family finally learned to listen before it was too late. And generation after generation, children walking beneath those towering redwoods heard the same story. That 70 years after a small iron box disappeared into the heart of a living tree, it returned to save an entire forest from disappearing forever. Sometimes, God doesn't perform miracles with thunder or lightning. Sometimes, He plants a small seed of hope inside an ordinary heart and waits for someone faithful enough to nurture it. Harold thought he was protecting an old forest, but perhaps God was using that forest to restore a broken family and remind the world that love, forgiveness, and patience can still change lives. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. May God bless you, your family, and may His peace guide you wherever life leads. Amen.